My name is Dr. Winsome Jackson. Welcome to the 8th Annual Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series at Sierra College. This year's event, yes, let's do that. This year's event is sponsored by the Associated Students of Sierra College, the Equal Employment Opportunity Committee, the Puente Club and Puente Program, La Semana Latina Foundation, the Student Engagement Center, and the Division of Student Equity. Let's thank those sponsors. As chairperson of the New Legacy Committee, I welcome you to a very unique opportunity to hear a range of diverse viewpoints, to shed light on an emotionally charged and difficult topic: human trafficking, sex, slavery, and extortion. At this point, I would like to recognize the organizers of today's event for their dedication and incredible accomplishment in bringing this event to our campus. Please stand and remain standing as I call your name so we can give you a nice round of applause at the end. Dr. Matt Archer, Professor of Anthropology and co-chair of the New Legacy Committee. Ralph de Unamuno, Associate Professor of History. Betty Chan, Associate Professor of Political Science. Sandy Escobar, Professor of Art and Sculpture. Jay Hester, Professor of History. Andre Mendoza, Associate Professor, Learning Resource Center. Monique Merritt, Student Engagement Specialist. Corey Morgan, Associate Professor, Administration of Justice. Wayne Robinson, Counselor, Coordinator of Black Excellence Program. Maria Salcido Bautista, Transitional Counselor, Sierra College and Lincoln High School. Natalie Sherrill, Lead Counselor, Advisor, and Counselor. Jennifer Scalzi, Counselor. Thank you all for your hard work. And of course, before I invite Dr. Ortega to the podium to give a few opening remarks, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. And I love to do this. So in the event of an emergency, an unlikely emergency, I'd like you to know that we have exits to the left and also to the right and directly behind you. We also have restrooms to the left as you enter the lobby. And at this point, I would like to ask Dr. Ortega to come to this podium to give a few opening remarks and to get our program started.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. I apologize for the weather. I wish there was something I could have done about that, but we're here and we're safe and we're dry. So welcome once again to the Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series at Sierra College. As I introduce myself, I wanted to let the audience know that I, like so many hundreds of thousands of others, had an opportunity in my life to support, serve, and protect the life of Cesar Chavez. We know him today as a leader who gave his life to carve out a path of social justice. His purpose in life was based on a doctrine of nonviolence, ya basta, the art of negotiation, the skill of compromise, and the strength of effective communication and mutual respect. Without a doubt, lessons for all of us to learn and to practice today. The Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series upholds these principles as we each year bring to you an opportunity to navigate through the most complex of issues that face our nation. On behalf of Sierra College and the Cesar Chavez Foundation, I also welcome you here today. My privilege is now to introduce you to our moderator for today's event, a colleague who will help us understand the complex, historical, and disturbing issue of human trafficking. Nicole Silverman earned her law degree from the University of the Pacific McGeorge Law School and a bachelor's degree in history from the University of California at Davis. Salud. Nicole is currently with the Arnold Law Firm in Sacramento. Please join me as I welcome Nicole Silverman to our stage as this year's moderator for the 8th annual Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series. Thank you.
Nicole Silverman, and I'm honored to be your moderator here today for the 2018 Sierra College Cesar Chavez Higher Education Speaker Series event, Human Trafficking, Sex, Slavery, and Extortion. We have so much that we're going to be covering in the next hour and a half. With an issue like human trafficking, we are really going to just gloss the surface of one of the most pressing issues to face our nation as a whole today and our local communities throughout California. So today we're going to have an open discussion about what human trafficking is, the various forms of it. We're going to talk about why it's a hot topic right now, both on a national level as well as on a local level throughout California and throughout our surrounding counties here in Placer County and Sacramento County, how women, men, and children are being recruited for human trafficking, as well as once human trafficking is recognized, the resources that are available to that person and what law enforcement and advocacy groups are doing in the communities to help fight human trafficking. So as a general overview, I just wanted to let you know I spoke with the panelists prior to the event. We recognize the fact that there's people that in the audience that have a preference on what they're referred to. So some people describe themselves as victims, some people describe themselves as survivors. I just want to let you know that you're going to probably hear both terms used today, and you'll probably hear them used interchangeably. We don't mean anything by that, we just want to let you know in advance so that you're aware, and that the panel's real ultimate goal in the end is for you to take the information that we're going to give to you today so that you can potentially apply it to the community, either by joining a local advocacy group maybe that you hear about today, or attending panels and seminars like this, or just talking in the community with your peers so that you're aware and they're aware of some of the resources that are available to them if they're being trafficked or if they know somebody who is. So with that said, I want to go ahead and get started, and I'm excited to introduce some of our panelists. We have a broad range of panelists from very diverse but overlapping backgrounds. But first, unfortunately, Assemblywoman Catherine Baker, she had something come up at the very last minute with a scheduling conflict, so she apologizes that she couldn't be here in person, but she wishes everybody the best. And so my first panelist that I'm going to introduce right now is Cristina Darte. So Cristina is the coordinator of human trafficking at Stand Up Placer in Roseville, California. I'm also going to introduce Mark Evans. So Mr. Evans is an author. He's the lieutenant of the Los Angeles Police Department, Human Trafficking Task Force Operations in the Valley Bureau. We have Elizabeth Liz Kim. Elizabeth is an advocate and the president of the National Lawyers Guild in the Sacramento chapter. And then we also have Carissa Phelps. So Ms. Phelps is an author, she's an attorney, she's an advocate, and she's also a survivor of human trafficking. So how I wanted to start this off is that often people equate sex trafficking with being human trafficking and it being one and the same. So can you discuss as a panel what the difference is between human trafficking and sex trafficking?
Well, I would say that initially, human trafficking is simply the exploitation of women, children, men, and you're exploiting them in some commercialized way, whether it's labor trafficking, sex trafficking. I think today the focus is sex trafficking, which tends to be where we're seeing a lot of the trafficking happening at. And then once you have the human trafficking component, that's really triggered by a few elements. Force, fraud, and coercion. So you use force, fraud, and coercion, but then also human trafficking is actually triggered by not being free to leave either. So those are the basic elements of the human trafficking.
So can we talk about some of the different ways that human trafficking is broken down? We have.
Yeah, and I think Mark's absolutely right. So the elements of force, fraud, or coercion are in all the different forms of the crime, but the experience of human trafficking, am I on the mic? Yeah. The experience of human trafficking, the way that people experience it and the way it's being seen and broken down is sex trafficking, adults and minors in that, and then labor trafficking, which you may or may not be familiar with, in creation of goods or services, but then also domestic servitude, which I think is very difficult to identify, very difficult. It's not out in a commercial or open marketplace, and less regulation in people's homes. So domestic servitude, I think, has been categorized in its own as well. And when I'm thinking about it in those three aspects. But people who have experienced any of those three may have, experienced the force, fraud, and coercion, which does similar harms. And I think we're finding services for each of them. But that's a general breakdown of it.
And I would add that there's so many changing numbers because it's such a hard thing that it doesn't get reported accurately. And there's so many studies, we're always trying to find how many people are actually subject to this. But some of the numbers that we've heard over the years is 21 million globally, that it's a $32 billion industry, and that less than 1% of them ever get prosecuted. And it's such a prevalent thing in the culture because it's such a big business that, even though we want to categorize it as sex trafficking, human trafficking, and different kinds of labor, it's also prevalent in the culture due to things like pimping and people that are being taken advantage of for various reasons, if they're runaways, foster children, things of that nature. So it's hard to grasp.
So can you elaborate more on why only 1% is prosecuted?
Yeah, and so I think there's various reasons for that. Most of the times the victims are also participants in the crime, and so they're very reluctant to come forward and call upon their perpetrator, whoever put them in that situation. And sometimes it's language barriers. They're not able to come forward because they're literally kidnapped from a different country and brought here. They're not able to come forward and know how to take the steps to bring attention to this, crime against themselves. And also, once they do get any kind of law enforcement to become involved, they themselves change their minds. They're subject to all of the different, stresses of litigation and embarrassment and victim shaming.
I think I just want to point out an important word you used, which was participant and not accomplice. So
Right, exactly.
There's no victim blaming here on this panel or anywhere around it. So yeah, more so I was, my body, myself, I was used in this crime, so I'm not sure where I stand. And maybe sometimes even through narratives I've heard of survivors, they've witnessed crimes that they're afraid to come out with their full story because they know there'll be holes in their story because there's certain things they want to leave out because they feel fear and shame around those instances, whether they were victimized or someone else was in front of them. And so, it's important to have a victim advocate around to explain these types of things. And if anybody in the room has that experience, to know the difference between participant and accomplice, totally different legal terminology.
I just would like to add to that. I like the word you used of fear. A lot of the clients that I support or the survivors that I work with is they have a lot of good reasons to not participate with law enforcement or to move forward in the prosecution through the case. It's a very long process. And if you could imagine, if you're under someone's control and you're complying and they are still harming you or not giving you freedom or hurting you, it's very likely that you would believe if you were going to leave the situation and work with law enforcement that you would be at more in a place of harm. And then also as far as the services sides, I think we have done a phenomenal job with trying to meet survivors where they're at and offer them the services so that they have other options or choices, but there are still some gaps. So law enforcement, from the time maybe a survivor comes into contact with law enforcement on the street to all the way to prosecution, there is a long period, sometimes up to 2 years. So it's knowing that's a big journey and where am I going to be supported along it, and if not, it could leave them at risk.
I think something to consider or to remember is that a lot of times when we talk about human trafficking, we're thinking of some faraway place. We're thinking of Guatemala, we're thinking of Mexico, we're thinking of the Ukraine, we're thinking of things like that. But the reality is, and probably my specialty is I deal with domestic trafficking, what's happening right here in the United States. I looked up last night, there's things that happened just locally in the not too distant past. And oftentimes we think that this doesn't apply to us. And I could tell you that I go out and combat this every single day. That's my primary function. And I tell my kids, everything that you have, the house you have, the cars you go to school in, the vacations, the clothes you wear, all that comes from me investigating human trafficking. I get paid to do that. And it's a huge, huge business. And I think it's important to remember this happens in every community, especially with the proliferation of the internet. It's allowing traffickers to exploit people in every community. I say that, you know, I'm using this broad term, every community, right? I'm a big fan of Life, the TV show Life Below Zero. So I know that there's people that live in Alaska that have no neighbors for 500 miles. There's probably no trafficking going on there. But to say it's happening in every community is not a stretch either.
So then let's move that then to why it's becoming such a hot issue right now. Because it's been happening in all of the communities for a very, very long time. But it seems to be more prevalent now in certain areas. So on a national level, I don't necessarily want to get into like politics itself, but how do immigration policies play into human trafficking?
That's a great. Do you want to take us out of it?
Ooh, do I want to take on immigration?
I mean, okay, well, if we're not trying to be, go
totally
ahead.
political
Yeah,
about
totally political. If you'd like to start.
I mean, so I think before you talk about immigration in any context, I think you have to talk about migration, and you know the fact that my parents, my grandfather came from Guadalajara and did a service here by working, doing things that people couldn't do during the time of war, and cutting down trees and doing some really massive labor work that he did, and he was welcomed and he was able to come here, and there's work that has to be done that is not serving any other purpose except this work that has to be done, and people migrate for that work, and it's normal. It's a part of our existence. It's if you've done your DNA or your 23andMe, you're the reason we're alive is because we've moved around. So I think it's not a political issue when you think about it like that it's just a human issue. It's just survival to move around. And when in terms of labor and the workforce and having a fair workforce, there's going to be exploitation. If we solved every immigration problem that was out there, there would still be exploitation with people within your families even being held and things being held over them. There's magazine sales where labor exploitation has been uncovered. These are for kids that are here in the United States. They're U.S. citizens. They didn't come from anywhere. There's every industry you can think of has some sort of exploitation possibility within it and has to be regulated. And that's why the Department of Labor is a huge partner in this, and they have a criminal division in California too that investigates the labor trafficking side of things. So I don't think that, like I said, if there was no immigration problem out there at all, you would still experience labor trafficking, and we still have to be aware of it because it's a different kind of abuse. It's a violent act against a human being, whereas immigration violations are sometimes an act against a border or a state, right? So think about human trafficking being more against the human being.
And I would like to add that, especially right now, I guess in answer to your question about why it's more prevalent right now, or at least more attention is put on it, is because, and this is just my theory from what I've read, is that there's a lot more social media capturing the things that are going on. There's more awareness and platforms to speak out on it. But in addition to that, our immigration policies having changed, and more of the ICE roundups have busted, people that are not here with legal documents. And so these people are seen as criminals, or being called criminals, when they were brought here by force, and they're not being given amnesty. They're not here because they were here by choice to break the law, but they were brought here by force. And then the United States actually is supposed to issue 2,000 visas for amnesties of people in that particular situation, but these victims don't know how to apply for that, or even know of it, or of its existence. And so those visas are just sitting there, and then they're considered to be illegal immigrants. And so that's where that problem with immigration crosses over with people that are here as human trafficking victims.
Something that I would point out is that I've been doing this since about 1998, and that was really, the term human trafficking didn't even exist. There wasn't even laws on the books about human trafficking until about 2000. And so I think that what's been fascinating is decades ago, to pursue a case criminally like this was very, very difficult to do, extremely difficult. But now there's been a big paradigm shift in probably the last 8 years. And now you're starting to see vertical prosecutions. You're seeing teamwork where we're partnering with NGOs, non-government organizations that are providing services. They're partnering with law enforcement. You have dedicated prosecution teams, and this issue's completely shifted. So I don't know that it's so much a hot topic, but awareness is off the charts. And also, I was involved in some advising of Proposition 25, which mandates training for human trafficking. And that passed out a couple election cycles ago. So I think that there's a lot of teamwork coming together that is raising the awareness, and it's changed. It just didn't suddenly become a hot topic, I don't think.
I think with the clients I work with, trafficking victims that have experienced sex trafficking. And so what we're seeing a lot more is more of our own citizens that are being trafficked. And so sometimes the immigration comes into it, not always, but with the clients that I do see that are not citizens, how these policies and how people feel and the laws that are there, really what it does is what I see, it's another barrier to them. They are, like you had pointed out, in this country, maybe they weren't brought here or came on their own. They don't know the laws, they don't know their legal rights, that they even have any. And so all they hear is this talk out there about how Americans don't want them here, and we're going to do this and build this wall and send them back. And so they don't even feel that they could take that first step. They feel, I'm not a citizen, I have no rights, I'm going to be deported, no one wants me here. So that's where I see we can be powerful in getting out to these victims and letting them know, no, you do have rights. There are services out there. There are visas that we can help you with, because it was not fair that you were brought into this country and treated poorly. Another thing that I'm seeing, and it came across why I think this hot topic, or why it's coming more to be, absolutely awareness is the number one. But it has been going on forever, as it's been around. And what I see in Placer County, why it's now really starting to get the attention that it needs, is because it's hitting a community that's not used to having it within the community. And within Placer County, yes, our own residents are being trafficked, but more so we have a problem with demand. We have a high demand here. And so if you look at it, if there's a demand, the supply is going to be brought here.
So why is the demand high here?
Well, if you think about, in general, who purchases are, what's the biggest group of purchasers, and there are a lot of those residents in Placer County. So I say that's exactly why. And of course, with social media and with it being really hidden, it's all done online. You don't have to find a stroller, a blade, and take the time and put yourself out there and make the connection and take the victim somewhere and have that engagement and then get back on to your daily life. You can do it all online. I've talked to a purchaser that said, yeah, it's as easy as ordering a pizza. I go online, I say what I want, when I want it, and if it's brought to me or I go to it, I can do it on my lunch break. And so there's lots of reasons of why it's easy to do, and that fire is really starting to grow.
So I'm going to talk more about recruitment, like a separate section on recruitment. So I wanted to see if there was anybody else that wanted to talk about, as far as on a local level, if there's like any socioeconomic reason why it's become a big it's more prevalent in like the Placer County, Sacramento counties than it has been in the past.
Well,
And if not,
Go
that's
ahead.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's just a lot of theories, I think, and I've read so much about this to try to explain it because it's hard to research a topic that is so underground. And that's the thing about this issue that makes it so hard to have people learn about it, is that it's such a big business with so much money involved and so little of it is in the present light for people to understand. But I think that the fact that there are more of us in the population who are struggling socioeconomically because, as we know, this is a global issue, but it's also a local issue, and it impacts people who are disadvantaged, and that it can be in many different forms. If they're coming from broken homes, if they're runaways, 1 in 6 runaways are subject to some kind of violent sex trafficking proposition. 86% of kids who are runaways that are under foster care are subject to some kind of human trafficking or sex trafficking proposition within 72 hours of running away. And so if the numbers of people in our community that are minors are more broken or insecure or hurt or not having a secure place of family to support them and protect them, then I feel like those numbers of them being subject to this kind of victimization is going to increase. So I know that some of the local, I'm sure you've read that we have issues in the Bay Area just recently. Just last year, we had Celeste Guap. I'm not sure if you've heard of that woman in the Bay Area. It implicated at least 5 police jurisdictions that involved police officers that were also involved in subjecting this minor to sex trafficking. There is a soccer girls coach here in Sacramento, right here at Kennedy High School, that was just arrested for having a van full of minor girls on Christmas Day. And so these are women that are more subject to this kind of advancement depending on their well-being, their emotional, physical well-being. So I think the health and wealth, both health and wealth of our youth has a huge impact on your likelihood of being victimized in this manner.
So how underground, because you're saying it's underground, how underground is it then? If you have recruitment tools, and we're going to talk about recruitment now, like websites that are readily available that people know about, like Backdoor or any of those. Let's talk about some of the different types of recruitment tools that are used, that you see like on a daily basis.
Yeah, sometimes you'll see on social media the story about someone's kidnapped off the street, someone jumps out of a van, swoops them up, kidnaps them, chains them, and then traffics them. I always say, does that happen? Yes, unfortunately it does. But what we're seeing across the board, whether it's with our children, our commercially sexually exploited children, our youth, or our adults, is that it's more times than not the tactic of recruitment is somebody approaching them, whether it's through social media, through a friend, family member, and really starting to build a relationship with them, really starting to not come in and right away be like, hey, this is who I am, this is what I'm gonna do, but instead building that relationship, filling a need. It's very true that no one's safe, but there are more vulnerable populations. And so when there is somebody that might not have a bed or a home or food, or they've never learned their value or been taught that there's more to them than being exploited, then it leaves the door open for somebody to come, build the relationship, and really be in a place where they're looked at as someone who is loved and trusted. This is usually a person that would fill a need that no one else ever before has. And then once they have built that trauma bond, once they have, manipulated them or used violence, whether that's emotional, physical, psychological, then they really have them under their control, and so they can go ahead and then exploit them. So usually we see that recruitment is definitely by someone. And when things are changing, and now what we see, and we've seen probably for a past year, is that it's not always the trafficker that does the recruitment, that oftentimes they will recruit one person and they will take that first victim and teach them what the life is and what the game and what the rules are and the discipline, and have them go ahead and start and force them to engage in the life. And then once they've gotten to the point where they've showed their trafficker, like, I know how to do it, I'm loyal to you, I'm gonna, be your ride or die, as they say, right? Then they go ahead and they get a promotion and they become now a bottom and they're forced to go out and recruit. And so it gets a little trickier to help people identify who you might be being recruited by. In the past, it was probably a male, maybe a male that looks like this or that's saying these words. But now it's really understanding that it could be a female, it could be a peer, it could be someone that you know for these recruitment tactics.
Would anybody like to add to that?
Well, so the false promises is every form of trafficking again, like the false promises and this development of a relationship where I'm going to solve all your problems. I'm somehow the answer to all of your problems, you know, whether it's an international victim being recruited to be a domestic servant here in the United States or somewhere else in the world. There's this promise of this life that is unbelievable in this person's eyes, and they want to believe it so much that they form this relationship and this bond with this person, and it's very difficult to extract them at that point or to give them other information. So we're trying to do a lot of prevention work to educate people about these tactics ahead of time, whether it's the labor trafficking and the international labor trafficking and reaching vulnerable populations there, or inside of communities where we know there are certain vulnerabilities. But this happens everywhere, like the trafficking that could happen anywhere and everywhere, especially with the internet. I have heard of, you know, internet trafficking, basically trafficking by creating videos and other forms of exploitive material that involve children, your youth, right? That can happen when you're downstairs having dinner and somebody's on a computer upstairs or a cell phone even. It could happen everywhere. So, you know, I don't know if I answered the question necessarily, but the recruitment through social media, online, through the websites, whether it's Backpage or another, is rampant. And the thing about the internet recruiting is that we ignored it for so long. It's absolutely fascinating to me that, like with the fake news thing that came out, how Facebook came out so fast to shut people down and shut that down. But we've been fighting for them to remove, you know, traffickers from online and do something about that for longer, right? So for so much longer, we've been upset about that. So you think about what hits their bottom line, right? Users don't maybe want to look at news because now through Facebook or see it as a trusted source, so they're changing it really rapidly and quickly. But when you think about, well, this is a tool that's being used to recruit our kids and to hurt them, they're not acting as fast. So that's us as consumers. I think we could do something about that.
Yeah.
Something specific to recruiting online, which is where we're seeing a lot of this going to. I'm familiar with a particular case where a trafficker was sending messages to, in this case, girls, and he had sent about 8,000 attempts to contact girls. So if you just do the math, I didn't hear any math professors mentioned in here, but if they were here to do the math, they would, you know, if just 10% responded, you know, you have an 80 or 800 people biting on that solicitation. And another example is that you could go to search hashtags, and I teach a lot about the value of hashtags, but you can look up hashtag 10 Toes Challenge. Yeah. And so my daughter was talking about this. So I have a 16-year-old daughter. And I was looking at this, and it was basically young girls doing some type of rap song, and it was talking about their life or overcoming struggles or dealing with struggles. And then they would post that. Well, 10 toes down is a term for 10 toes down means a trafficker has one prostitute in his little group. So here's an opportunity for you to post all about the hardships you have in life, and then traffickers can search those hashtags, and then they can make contact with you because you've had a tough life, you just rapped all about it, and now they can try to solicit you, and then that ties into, they can be your Mr. Wonderful, they can give you, promise you the world, and then start the exploitation process. Mm-hmm. One other thing is that you can go on to, and I challenge you to go to this, and I'm not responsible for what you see, but look up 304s, 16s, and weirdos. And that's a web, it's on every social media platform, and it's a human trafficking website. And you see all the pimps there. They're not trying to hide anything that they're doing. Mm-hmm. They're out there. In fact, I've been able to link people from that to other crimes that they're wanted for. And so you can get into that into that, I'm calling a website, but you could look at that and you could be able to see what this lifestyle is all about and the brainwashing that takes place and how they exploit people. And the meaning of that is 304s is a term for hoe, and that's a numeric term that they use, like the old days with the calculator, type in the numbers, whatever. And then 16 is the 16th letter of the alphabet, which is P. P stands for pimp. And then weirdos speaks for itself. No shortage of those people around. But you could look at that and start to get into the mindset of these individuals, and also look at the culture. And they're not hiding anything.
Yeah, that's what brings it back to what you were saying about underground, and whether if it's not as underground as it used to be.
I wanted to comment on that just because I've done some work in Amsterdam and places where prostitution has been legalized with this idea and guise of safety for the people who are being exploited sexually and empowerment for them. So big quotes around that. It's difficult because when you go into another culture or space or community, you want to honor their belief systems and what they're doing, and not take away any power, especially from somebody who is feeling like they're an empowered sex worker and that's what they're doing. And my primary goal when I was going in there was talking to people who had also experienced trafficking. They were, saying they were sex workers, but then they had also experienced some exploitation and trafficking in that experience. And the entire economy around the sex workers there, from tourism to renting that space, they rent these windows, and the way they pay the rent for those windows, the whole thing is very exploitative. You can look into it more again by talking to individuals who have been in that work and in that line of work there, and then have also experienced trafficking and exploitation. I was fortunate enough to be working alongside of a person who spoke 5 languages, so we can go into various spaces and talk to people from various backgrounds who had been recruited there with false promises. One particular young woman we were talking to had been the victim of a horrific sexual assault, kidnapping and sexual assault, and was ignored by law enforcement. So a lot of the trafficking or sexual assault, or even just violent crimes done against them, robberies, things like that, are not taken seriously because their position in that society is still seen as different. And then if you are from an international victim and in that area, an immigrant, then you're not maybe seen as important as someone who maybe not, who wasn't. So it's a fight to, even when it's out in the open, to see the victimization. People want to look away from victimization and from the actual harms that are done, even when these are things that are done, quote, out in the open, either on the internet or out in a window. I feel they're still ignored, victims and what's happening to them.
Are we moving away from that now with law enforcement?
I don't think it's a law enforcement problem. I think it's a society problem. I don't think it's a law enforcement problem at all. I think, with particular reporting, if you have a trained human trafficking task force that is victim-centered, trauma-informed, you're going to get a good response and a terrific investigation by those law enforcement officers, some of which Mark has trained, some I have trained, some we both trained. But there are people out there who are doing really great work in law enforcement, so I wouldn't downplay that at all. What I think is that we have this idea that maybe it's not as bad as what people are saying. Right? Maybe we're saturated in awareness. We know it's out there, but we have this feeling and this sensation like maybe it's not so bad. Maybe that dream of, oh, this is how someone works their way through college, it still exists, or it's still a reality that being a stripper or a go-go dancer, whatever you want to call it, is still an opportunity for someone to be empowered. And it's really getting to know people who have had that life experience and understanding their journey and the things they've gone through that will educate you. And that's hard to do. It's hard to take time for that in our lives. It's hard to pay attention to it and understand it, and then to direct the resources, like Christina, and the legal resources too that are needed to address it. So it's just not an easy solution, I guess. But it's not a law enforcement problem.
I think one other thing to consider is there's a major societal disconnect where you see a girl, they might post some advertisement online or make it even more dramatic, they're standing on the street corner. They're clearly out there selling themselves. They're wearing a seductive clothing. They're wearing a short skirt. They're wearing high heels. They're clearly selling something. But too often, society looks at that individual. They'll call the police and say, hey, I want this person off of the corner. We're totally missing the boat thinking that she's out there of her own volition. 90% or even more of the girls that I associate with have traffickers. So they're out there, they were told what to wear, they were told where to stand, they were told how much to charge, they were forced and coerced into doing this. That's the elements of the crime. And so too often, society looks at that and goes, oh, she's a prostitute, she wants to be there. Clearly not connecting what's going on behind the scenes. I think that's
So when you have somebody like, when we're on the street, what do we do? What are the most common signs of somebody that is being trafficked? How do we recognize that?
I'm not so sure you look at that and recognize that because the traffickers are hiding, right? The traffickers are hiding behind the scenes. So from a law enforcement perspective, you need to step back and need to look at the bigger picture. Don't focus on the individual standing on the corner or posting the ad. Look at the individuals who are watching that individual. An interesting scenario, I had a situation where I had some people riding along with me in a car, and there was a girl that was working on the street, and I was explaining this exact concept to them. And I go, oftentimes police officers will go and historically we would arrest that individual. I think there's been a big paradigm shift, and that's not the focus anymore. We want to go after the trafficker, and I explained, these traffickers, they'll be sitting in these alcoves in these dark areas, and they're watching. And no sooner than when I finished that sentence, this trafficker walks out in front of my car. Had he been any closer, he would have been a hood ornament on my car. And he yells at the girl and says, hey, bitch, get in that car and make me some money. And I go, just like that. So from a law enforcement perspective, stop focusing on the girl and focus on what's around the girl and go after the traffickers. And more importantly, these traffickers, what I'm seeing, we're seeing gangs transition to this crime. And we're talking the most violent gang members. I was a gang officer for many years. I deal with more violent gang members in my current assignment than I ever have. And the threat is real. So we need to just remember that when we're doing investigations.
So as far as law enforcement is concerned, then what's some of the biggest problems that law enforcement is running into in terms of
specific to human trafficking? I think the absolute biggest need for law enforcement right now is services for housing. So we can society throws a lot on a police officer. They want you to be a psychologist, they want you to be a domestic violence counselor, they want you to be a counselor for youth, and police officers enforce the law, and they're trained across the board to do a lot of other things. But there's a point where I need medical facilities, I need psychological care, I need housing, I need clothing, and I need support structure and mentors to help these people go to court and testify against their traffickers. And that's where these nonprofits come into play, and you have to have partnerships there to successfully prosecute these individuals.
And just so I could point out, because I'm joined here by a colleague, Russell Wilson, and I'm so aware that there are also boys involved and have been trafficked, and he's an expert in the larger area of human trafficking, but addresses male trafficking as the victim, being a male as well. So it's not only girls, so we just don't want to give you that one image of trafficking.
Yes. So can you talk about the relationship then that you have with NGOs that are in Los Angeles and how that works with your department?
I could talk about the NGOs. I can talk about that, and then we talked during lunch, and there's some similar setups here. But typically, law enforcement's a little hesitant to trust anybody, right? We don't trust a lot of people. But
Especially not the kumbaya advocates.
but there's been a big change in this dynamic because I've come to realize, I've been doing this for 24 years. I've come to realize that you cannot successfully prosecute a human trafficking case without an NGO. And these non-government organizations come in, they don't have certain mandates that they have to follow that I might have to follow. They can provide mentors to strengthen victims, to help them go and testify against their trafficker. They can provide life skills to help them get out of the situation that they're in. Sometimes I'll talk to some girls who have been victims, and we talk to them about just taking on a normal life, right, a job, and they're like, you want me to get a job making minimum wage? I don't know what the minimum wage is now, but at the time, like $9 an hour. I can make $1,000 an hour this other way. So you have to even change their psychological thought process. And, you know, I got a criminal justice degree. I don't change psychological thoughts. But that need is there. And that's where the partnerships come into play, and it's extremely critical.
Can you talk about the partnerships that you have in the community as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been very fortunate to build strong collaborations with the law enforcement within Placer County. We do not have a human trafficking specific task force, but we do have 2 really strong task force that work to combat human trafficking. So they do other crimes also. And that is Placer's SIU and Roseville's Crime Suppression Unit. And so when we were really building our program and seeing like, we can't do anything or offer any service if there's not a survivor in front of us. So when we were building our program, we talked to survivors and said, what was the best way? How could we come into contact? What is your need? So when we're saying we'll meet you where you're at, literally we'll meet you where you're at, we'll come there, right? And so finding out that a lot of times they do come into contact with law enforcement, so seeing how that was a very beneficial relationship, whereas they could help us get in front of the clients so we can offer these services and support them, and then same thing that we did have those services that they would need. Because I think for law enforcement, at least I've seen, and I've been so impressed as an advocate, and like the joke of law enforcement advocates, you know, black and white and like tree huggers, it's hard to get along, or not, you know, to have the same goal, right? But in seeing that, I've been very impressed and very grateful to our law enforcement that has tried to help victims of trafficking instead of coming in and arresting them, just like you're saying, looking at, well, who's really the problem in this situation, going after the purchasers, the ones that are creating this demand, that are violating these people, you know, and really making it acceptable. Oh, it's better than they've had, or oh, they like it, they're an adult, you know, things like that. So with our law enforcement is establishing relationships to say, okay, you're going to be out on scene. Can we be there with you? How can we work together? And so in Placer County, we do that. Our law enforcement, if they are going to set up an operation or be out there, they call us out, and we're one of them. We're on scene with them. And we're allowed to engage with the clients, offer them services, help them understand that situation. I think that that's really important. When you're in a situation, it's scary and you don't know what choices would be, just to have someone there that can help support you through that and let you know what choices that you may have. It's been very, very beneficial to our law enforcement. And we have also seen it go up through the DA's office, where now we are having prosecution, because just like he said, it's perfect of being able to say, you know, this is really scary, but we're going to take it step by step by step, you know, and helping them and coaching them and really just supporting them.
And I'll add that knowing about what nonprofits there are in the local areas that do support helping victims and people who are subject to this. And we have Opening Doors in Sacramento. We have My Sister's House. They offer housing for people who have been victims of human trafficking. And even Weave, you know, anyone who's been a victim of domestic violence, those kinds of nonprofit organizations offer housing, and the National Lawyers Guild offers pro bono legal services for people who need attorneys that can't afford the representation and need some kind of legal guidance to help them along the way. And then the most important thing is, obviously with law enforcement, like Mark said, it's not for them to help heal this problem. It's try to exercise as much preventive care as possible, because it really does come from the well-being of each individual to be able to protect themselves against this type of targeted act of making them victims. And these people literally prey on people who have struggles in their life. And for us to invest in our community and our women and children, and not just women and children, but our men as well, to educate them and have them be in a good place mentally and emotionally to be able to, you know, not need someone to come along and give them false promises, is really the best way to combat this from the root, rather than having to, you know, assist them after they've already been hurt this way.
Absolutely.
Did I say I know some amazing survivors, like amazing, that speak those 5 languages and that have degrees from top universities and have also had this life experience? And there's one, Rachel Thomas, who comes to mind that, she went away from a safe, kind of community in Pasadena, living with her family, to college and Emory University, and was approached in a club by a person who said, look, if I looked like you, I'd make $1 million. I'd have $1 million. I'd be a millionaire. And played on this idea that she could be a model, and gave her this contract and collected the home address of her parents, and then coerced her within just a few weeks into sex trafficking. So anyone, you can create vulnerabilities with, the desire or dream to be a millionaire, or to have more than what you had, or have that attention. So I don't want to give you that impression that it's not there. But the interesting thing with her experience is she came out of it educated. She was able to stay in school. This predator, he preyed on young women who are away from school at small colleges within a certain radius around Atlanta, and he had a multicultural, modeling company is what he called it, and he threw these parties and trafficked them out of clubs and out of strip clubs and things like that. But her experience when she came out of it, she actually had to wear a wire for the FBI because she was being seen as a recruiter, because she was forced to hand a card to somebody. And I'll let her share more of her details of her story, but the thing, when she came out of it, she still felt this psychological connection to the person who had victimized her, and almost a sense of, oh, he wasn't that bad, was he? And it was that journey she took from that point inside of books about cults and mind control that led her to some of her healing and her ability to disconnect from this bond she had with him. And she created a curriculum called Ending the Game, which I'm going to shamelessly promote. We invested in, and we love it, and it's a 10-class curriculum that she created that talks about these psychological concepts in an empowering way with a person who may have experienced them, so that they could be able to dismantle some of these affections and connections they may have, either to a life or a lifestyle, or to the individuals who've been trafficking them. It is, this is complicated stuff. It's not just something that you take someone and pick them out of an area and then take them to a safe place. It's very complicated, the dynamics that are going on here, and we're fortunate to have survivors who have now been empowered and equipped to come up with solutions like this. So as we go forward in this, I don't want to give anybody the impression that we're all going to put on some superhero cape and go and rescue people. It's a long, intensive, resource-intensive, which takes the NGOs to process to get someone to a place where they can make those decisions and be empowered to move forward. And I just know enough survivors to know that all of us, it takes time.
So then I want to follow up with that then on the process and the critical points that it took for you to get where you are today here on the stage.
Yeah, I started doing this work because I wish I had met Mark, when I was 12 years old. And I wish he had been the officer that had seen that I was forced out onto the streets at 12 years old. I met some officers out there that handcuffed me, that took me to jail, that treated me like a criminal, that threatened me, and said to get off the street. But I didn't meet him. And so when I started doing this work, I really wanted to just see that victims in that initial contact with law enforcement were treated more like the kid on the milk carton, right? Like, oh my gosh, Carissa, it's you. You've been missing. You've been reported missing, and we found you. How that would have felt so much different than being handcuffed and taken into a police car. Now, that was one point where I was removed physically from a trafficker, so it was an important point of time for me. But I did 30 days in juvenile hall, and he probably did less than 24 hours because there was so much missed there. And then I spent years spiraling and cycling in and out of juvenile hall and off the streets without someone like Christina and without a lawyer representing me that could see what was going on in this case file, right? What's actually going on. And so as I went, I was fortunate enough, and I think lucky and blessed enough that God had created this path where, Ron Jenkins, who was a criminal justice major, who didn't necessarily know what he was doing, but was in his early 20s and sat down and saw that, you are a victim. He had grown up in South Central LA. He knew gangs, he knew violence, he knew trafficking, and he said, you're a victim, and some of these things that happen to you are not your fault. Let me get you help. Let me get you and your mom into family counseling and therapy, and I was fortunate that he put together this RQJ program, I call it, right, for me while I was locked up for this stretch of time of 6 months, and I had an opportunity to go to camp called Camp Esteem, where it was the Boys and Girls Club who put that on, and I was the only kid released from juvenile hall. I went in shackles literally to camp, and had those shackles taken off, and had a counselor who packed a camping bag for me and made sure I had the stuff so that I could rappel off a rock and build my confidence and feel strong. And still not all the problems were solved then. I found out I was good at math when I was in juvenile hall. That was important, knowing I could do something better than some of my counselors. and that was important, and it was a critical point in my life when I decided to be a math major at Fresno State and do that and focus on math. I love math and love answers. So I think there was all these different points that now we're trying to recreate, and they're not just one moment of time. They're all ingredients to success. And if you look back on your own life, they were there for you in order to be in this seat today. And they need to be there for all survivors as well, who oftentimes are abandoned, ashamed of where they've come from, not able to go back home, or don't have a home to go back to.
So how do we make those available now to the 12-year-old kid?
Well, I love that there's money now available for some of these solutions, because unfunded mandates are saying, yeah, you must do all of this without actual funding and investment in solutions is really difficult. But we have to continue to innovate. We can't just be stagnant. It's just like with any educational system, whether it's here at junior college level or it's at education in elementary school or pre-K, you have to continue to innovate. And with our victim services and with the work that we do, I think we have to continually meet survivors where they're at, and they may be moving. I mean, traffickers are smart, they're wise, they're trying to figure out new ways to manipulate the situation and still make profit and off of people and their flesh. So we have to stay up with that and really continue to invest in smart solutions that are effective, and working together we can do some of that. So collaboration too.
I agree. I think collaboration is number one. That is where I have seen the most success, because when you have a lot of people that are coming around and trying to work on something, you have a lot of different experiences or skills to offer, but really you have a lot of eyes building a safety net, so that if there is a child or there is somebody and there's not one person that has provided something and they have a lot of different needs, being able to collaborate so there's never that hole. So if they're working with law enforcement and law enforcement sees, okay, there's a service we can't offer, then go to the victim services, and then if you can't do it, so that there's not one place where there is that gap. Collaboration is huge. And I think something even more so that we all can do today, if we do decide like we are not okay with human trafficking, whether it's our own citizens, adults, children, or foreign-born nationals, that we can all change even the way that we speak about victims. Often, way too often, there's still the stigma, and survivors, they feel it. If there's all these barriers that we can talk about as far as language barriers or education or low income or not enough safe houses, those are some things that are going to take some time to work through, and we all might have to pull a barrier to work on. But one thing we all can agree on is if we can understand they are victims, they don't have choices, they would rather not be here, there's no benefit, then we can all first start by just changing the way that we look at them, that we address them. So trying to change the words that we use. Don't talk about them being prostitutes, talk about them being victims or being forced into this type of sex work, right? Or when it comes to children, remembering that there's no such thing as a child prostitute. Children cannot give consent, therefore they cannot be, a prostitute. So knowing that when we are looking at adults or people over the age of 18, we have to look for force, fraud, or coercion and kind of look for that. But if it's under the 18, right away, they are a victim. And so when I talk with survivors, many times that's what they would say is, it's great there's a safe house. It's great there's people that want to help. It's great that you can help me in housing in a year. But because of the shame, because of the guilt, because of the fear, because of the fact that as humans, we all want to be liked and accepted and loved. And when I talk to someone and they're like, oh, that's horrible, you're a prostitute, how do you, right away they're like, I shut down. They don't understand me because they're seeing me as something, not as who I am and the value that I have.
I think something that Carissa brought up about her first interaction, or I'm saying the first time she had interacted with the police, and they didn't really make the connection of what was going on. And I see that I have a consulting firm. I go all over the United States, Canada, trained tons and tons of people from the FBI to the U.S. military, law enforcement, hundreds of agencies. And so I'm glad to say that there's a lot of training going on so that officers don't respond that way anymore. I had a friend. This guy is the ultimate police officer. This guy has won every award under the sun. He's just a great cop. And he had a human trafficking case that involved 2 juveniles who were runaways, about 16 years old, and 2 male gangsters. And they were at a abandoned home, and the garage had a couch, and it was had discarded condoms all over the place. So in this conversation, he said, well, I couldn't do anything. These guys were gang members. We didn't have anything on them, and these girls were just some stupid runaways. And I heard that, and I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but I couldn't get too mad because he had never been trained. So it's critical that we provide training to law enforcement, because people think cops know everything. There's hundreds of laws that go on the books every year, and cops don't know all the laws. A lot of them specialize, and so you need to make sure that across the board, officers know what's going on. And that's something that came about with Proposition 25, is that mandated training for first responders. And I'm seeing now, 6, 7, 8 years into this process, I'm starting to see officers' mindset change. And so hopefully the next 12-year-old that an officer comes in contact with, they sit back and they look at all the things that were just brought up. Can a 12-year-old be a prostitute? And I think we are rounding the corner on that, and awareness it's way up there, but there's still a lot of work to do.
So with that proposition, does the training start at the very beginning, right when an officer becomes an officer, or is it like an ongoing training that?
Can I talk about Proposition 35 a little bit?
Sure.
So, but there's 2 hours of mandated training, and you do this for 8 hours, right? Like there's 2 hours of mandated training in Proposition 35 that says there's this mandated training. One of the other real big, training is a key component of it, but also it increased the penalties for human trafficking of a minor. Human trafficking was on the books from 2006, but you're right, law enforcement didn't know about it. They weren't, and also prosecutors weren't pushing it because pimping was a lower hanging fruit that was easier to prosecute and had the exact same penalties as the human trafficking 236.1, I think. So it was as if it didn't exist, even though the human trafficking laws were on the books, because the penalties were the same as pimping and pandering, and so they would go after this lower hanging fruit that didn't require a victim testimony and all of the other more difficult things to prove. So what happened with Proposition 35 is the training was mandated, and on the prosecution side, the penalties were increased, and especially with minors. And so now I want to go after that case. I want to go after that crime because that crime has more penalties, and that's something that drives a decision of how to prosecute a case. So then you have the cross-training with the DA wants those cases, and so they're really implementing more training than the 2-hour requirement. And trying to get more than the 2-hour requirement.
And that's when it's so beautiful when the laws can catch up with the crimes, right? And makes it so everyone can work together.
Do we know of any other legislation that's going on right now that is helping in terms of
There's like 18
Human trafficking?
just passed, right? There was a lot, like 18, I think, that
Did you
just
say
recently
a cascade
passed.
of legislation like
Yeah,
that? No, there's new legislation all the time, but the one thing that I think is wonderful is that some of the funding, I'm going to talk about money again, I do have an MBA, full disclosure, right? So some of the funding that is requiring this training and of making it possible to do the training that we have to do is finally accessible and out there and available, and offering service money is available now for offering services. I know a person who runs a nonprofit legal organization who's been doing it just by her bootstraps, grassroots, out of her own funding, representing people legally, and now she's able to apply for a grant and go out there and get the funding that she needs to expand. So that's a huge part of it. It's not just about making the correct laws, but it's also training on those laws and implementing those laws that are on the books.
And I know that studies have shown in the past that less than 20% of law enforcement are even trained on how to identify human trafficking because it's such a difficult thing to identify. But I'm hoping that that number has changed. I know that the last time I pulled that number was last year, so I don't know if anything drastic has changed in the year, but hopefully that's something that we can...
Well, one thing that's happening is, so in my case, I got plugged in with the fusion centers, and the fusion centers, they're connected to counterterrorism measures. So I'm going to go off just for 1 second, but terrorists use human trafficking to fund their operations as well, and I won't go on. That's a conversation for another day, I guess. But we're seeing that. I drew a blank now. I'll come back to it. I forgot what I was going to point out. So I turned 47.
I think it's the lights. It's very intimidating with the lights.
That's a great one to bring up, though, because I don't think people do understand that terrorists do use human trafficking to fund their projects. And, a human trafficking victim, I think the going rate that I've read is somewhere between $1 to $2 million a person, that the person gets paid, not the person being sold. And, during climate change, natural disasters throughout the world, when there's a hurricane or a tsunami and thousands of people are getting displaced and they're all of a sudden homeless and they're being put in compounds, these people are kidnapped or taken from those areas. So they're more subject to being victimized by these organizations that prey on people who are displaced in these situations. So that's another thing that we can't even get into, but that's a whole other topic that you brought up that prompted me to say that.
Came back to me.
Oh, perfect.
So the fusion centers, they get funding from the federal government, and it trickles down to the probably like the larger sheriff's departments, those regions, and then they take that money and they allocate it for specific types of training. So they'll pay me to go and train. That's how I go all over the country and train people. And we'll do class of 100, 200 people sometimes. So it's happening. It's formalized. The funding's there, and you can only train so many people at a time. There needs to be a lot more out there. People want to know, what can I do to help? And to a large extent, the first contact any victim is ever going to have is going to be with a law enforcement officer. So in my mind, I've been pounding the drum for 5 years. You have to train officers, train, so they know what they're seeing. And then we don't have a situation like my friend who didn't even recognize a human trafficking case that was painfully obvious.
The other thing about the fusion centers that I love is that they are not just law enforcement officers. They're all types of first responders that come together to address terrorism. Then they address human trafficking as well and how it intersects with terrorism. But they also have community members that are a part of the fusion centers and help identify. So people in areas where trafficking might be a destination place in big conventions or in the security businesses, identifying it on that end, or people who provide security for amusement parks and things like that, because a lot of us have those stories where that's been the lure or that's even been the place where they were taken to an amusement park parking lot where the trade has gone on. So it's a wonderful concept and idea of bringing in the fusion centers to work on this, and it cross-trains everybody and brings them together, because it is sometimes law enforcement, sometimes it's an EMT that's the first responder, or a fire department person that might be the first responder as well, and everyone needs to be trained, everyone, just like CPR, right? Everyone, many as people as we can, need to be trained to identify it and then to take the next steps.
To reinforce what Carissa's saying, they also plug in Los Angeles, they're plugging in the health department. So I've been training all these health department inspectors, which I thought was really strange, but they started to explain why they were doing it, because they're going to be doing inspections at these massage parlors, which is blowing up. There's a massive amount of human trafficking happening in massage parlors. I think, in my opinion, that's the nut that hasn't been cracked yet. We're not really effective at addressing those types of investigations for a variety of reasons, but language barriers probably number one, and then lack of trust. Sometimes people coming from an international community, they're coming from Korea, China, Thailand, the whole gamut, right? They're coming to our country, and they're a little hesitant. One, there's a language barrier, but two, they're hesitant to report, because in their countries, oftentimes, the law enforcement own the brothels, right? There's a lot of corruption in the law enforcement outside of, in their countries. So there's a little reservation there, but I thought it was interesting to see them plugging in these health inspectors to help combat human trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Or they don't know how our legal system even works sometimes. And I have a friend, another survivor I'm going to mention, but Christina Ronhell, who's up in the Redding area, and she does outreach to massage parlors in Tahoe and in the Redding area, because she saw them popping up everywhere. And as a survivor, she realized, she was so invisible. Even if she was on the streets in Las Vegas when she was being victimized, she was so invisible, and she just felt that the people who were in those massage parlors were invisible, and there weren't health department people going in there and checking in on them. So she created this ministry of roses and chocolate, and she brings roses and chocolate to people, and she's extracted dozens of victims, and some of them minors, and she works closely with the FBI there and other law enforcement. But it's an amazing thing that when you build relationship with people and understanding how many people you can rescue and save in that way. So,
and just to add, there's more Uber drivers that are identifying human trafficking as well lately. So that's another thing that's a developing, hopefully, impact to the community and identifying most. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to know what we're doing in Placer County, absolutely. When we set up our outreach and we mapped out how are we going to get this information out there, starting, you start small and you get your way out there. So starting with trying to work with the first responders, and the training's been huge. I know in the first we were like, you need in, trying to get in there, and now the calls are just coming in, and we've trained law enforcement and first responders and children's system of care and health departments and schools and all of that, because the training, if we can go out there and multiply the number of people, then they're all going to be able to identify and help on their own part. And so the training aspect, along with that collaboration, is huge. And I think, like boots on the ground, you always start there and you go out. And we do the same. We go to massage parlors, we go to the hotels, we do the Uber drivers, all these different parties that might have the eyes on it, and let them know, yes, it's happening. These are some things you can look for. Here's an outlet in case you do, come across and how you can respond.
So if there's a student that's here today that's listening to what's happening and they're inspired by what's being said and they want to somehow get involved in whether it's trainings or whether it's having a career path that goes that way, what would you recommend for them?
I would recommend, first I would say thank you. Thank you for having this topic, be your passion, and for wanting to do something. And then I would just encourage them to take the step to kind of think about what was said today that maybe caught your ear or inspired you or made you upset, or a skill that you see you could add to it, and then just start there. And it's just like with trafficking, it's a very big journey. I think we've all said that. There's a lot of parts. There's a lot of things that can be done to help people that are in the trafficking. So kind of figure out, what do you think that you have to do, and then start. I know Stand Up Placer, we have volunteers, but also we have advocates that if you just want to say, hey, this is what I'm interested in, can you give me some information, that we will definitely help you get into the movement to see. I think that's one place where we can be empowered ourselves, with not being like, wow, this is overwhelming, there's so many parts and so many problems, and how can I help? But knowing, yes, you can. And just really, I encourage you just to reach out there to whether, anyone up here or anyone else in the movement, and just say, I have a passion. Because what I have found is that most people working on this issue, they want more people to come aboard. I haven't met many people that are like, nope, we're working on this program, we don't need any more help, stay away. It's usually more that community is such a wonderful thing.
Well, I say go be a police officer.
Yes.
I think one thing that is interesting is that there's no shortage of negativity in the media for police officers. No shortage at all. And I could tell you that the negative stuff that's out there is a very, 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 very small percentage. It's so small, I don't even know if Carissa could do the math to tell me what that small number is.
She could.
But there's so much good going on, and it's so rewarding when you can go and do something that you're passionate about. I think I have the best job in the world. And one thing that stands out in my mind, I had a girl, she's a victim of human trafficking. She is a valedictorian, and she got swindled by a friend, and she was held hostage effectively and trafficked. And the case ran its course, and I saw her about a year later when the jury trial was actually happening. And so I walked up and I said hi to her mom, and her mom asked her, do you know who that is? And she goes, yeah. She's like, who is that? I didn't think she'd remember my name. And she goes, that's my hero. And you know, as a police officer, you don't hear that too often. And that was pretty rewarding personally to see that she didn't have the experience that Carissa had, because I understood. I sat down with her, I talked to her for hours to hear her case, and I promised her a commitment that I would do everything possible to hold her trafficker accountable. So, you know, I've never sat in the roles that these women have. I'm probably not smart enough to do that. But there's a lot of good that can be done in the law enforcement world.
Absolutely.
I'm just being educated and being here, all of you guys here listening to us and being interested in learning about the problem is a step. And having this type of panel organized to educate the community and spread the word on breaking down the stigmas around the victimization and the offending of it is the step that we can take, and to have these discussions, because sex trafficking is not an easy conversation to have. There's a lot of stigma that goes with that. So for every single one of you guys sitting out there in the audience today listening to us, and this story is really inspiring in itself. So
Absolutely.
that's huge.
Yeah, I always say, yeah, be willing to ruin some barbecues, some family events.
How about
Keep it downer.
Amen to
Yes. No, really being able to go to that uncomfortable place is, and I was speaking to a group of students yesterday, that's the next step after awareness. Once you're aware is one thing, and you could see it and you could spot it, but really believing it enough to take action in your life. And every one of you have a unique calling for what you're going to do next. And because we know trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, domestic servitude, sex trafficking, it's also rampant. Every one of you are going to have an ability and an opportunity to do something. And so if you are a consumer, which we are, even here consuming our education, you have an influence. And when I train people, no matter if they're all from the same agency, but rarely do I do that, I try to be very diverse in the audiences I reach at the same time, because otherwise it's everyone else's fault, right? If it's law enforcement, it's all the social workers' fault. If it's social workers, it's all law enforcement's fault. So when we're combined here together, every one of you individually have a unique thumbprint in life experience. You have family members who maybe have experienced trafficking. You have things that have gone on in your life that you understand this in a different way than the person sitting next to you. And so you have a unique contribution that you can make. Absolutely. And so keep that in mind, keep that in focus, that you matter to this issue and to the work that goes forward. There are many victims we know of sexual assault, and yet, we know 3 out of 4, women, and sometimes it's 1 out of 6 men. We're not sure who have. This number of people have been victimized, but at these events, you don't see people coming up to you and saying, I'm a rapist, right? You're not going to have it in your face, people telling you that they've done these acts, but you need to make sure that your voice is strong enough and your presence is strong enough that you make it known to any of that evil or any of that stuff that's around you that it's not okay. Right? You have to live out that presence in your life and call it what it is, and call law enforcement when you need to, and back up people who are moving forward to call people out and to say, you're accountable for the things that you've done to others. Do that. It's going to make people uncomfortable, but that's how change happens. So, thank you.
Absolutely.
So if there's anybody else that, we have a few minutes, and we have a couple minutes if anybody has any pressing questions. Otherwise, we just want to thank you for being here today and for listening to all the panelists. So
So No More, K-N-O-W, no, like no more, is a youth-based, you'll be able to do like youth-based 3-hour, sessions. So
3 strands. Yeah.
yeah, so but No More is an actual theater-based thing that came out of PLNU.
I think it's
Point
great.
Loma
I was just
Nazarene
going to
Youth?
say with Rotary, I know they're using 3 strands.
Okay,
which has a curriculum.
So those education and prevention opportunities.
It's really important. Of course, you're talking about training our youth is important part so that they respect women and men and don't get into this situation.
Absolutely.
I just want to add is there wasn't we touched on earlier, but not a lot about sex consumers and what we do for better legislation about the Johns. Because without demand, this problem goes away.
Absolutely. I think that's one place that we all can really put a little bit more pressure on changing the laws. I do see that when...
Well, one of the most significant things I see, and the laws have changed over the course of 2 decades, but if we could impound John's cars for 30 days at a time, that would be a huge impact. And honestly, there's some people who don't have the political will to do that, and that's takes community members saying we're not standing for that anymore, and we demand change.
Point you to the state of Washington that's done, they have $5,000 fine and a 3-week training course for John in their car.
Yeah, we're working here in Placer County with the DA's office that hopefully there will be like an intervention program set up through the court system so that the Johns, the purchasers, that they would have to go through that, because I do think awareness is one. I do like what he's saying, though. He's being right about the very practical things. I've been on scene with law enforcement. I will talk to a purchaser. I will educate them, know their reasons. They get their citation and they walk out the door, and so I think things like that is taking their car away. So maybe would that stop you in thinking, now I'm not going to be able to get to my job. Now people might wonder what I'm doing. It's going to inconvenience them. I think he's very right
Taking
about
the car away because you've used it in pursuit of committing
Absolutely.
this crime, right? So
Right.
there's a reason, a
Take
legal
their
reason
phone.
for taking it away, taking the phone away.
Make them do 290
quit
registrants.
not calling them John. How
Yeah.
many Johns are in here, right?
The purchaser.
Do not call them John anymore. Do not make them human. We call the victims prostitute, which is a criminal code and violation, and then we call these people that are rapists and assaulters and exploiters the name that gives them a face that makes them somebody that we maybe votes for us. I don't know what goes on
brother's name is
politically,
John,
but yeah. So I think we have to really be conscious and aware about language that was given to us by a trafficking culture, and that includes that term bottom. I don't use that term because that's the person that may be most trafficked and most under the control of somebody. So just being aware of that. Or do we have time? I'm all running.
I think we have final remarks.
Final remarks.
If there's any more questions, I'm sure that we can meet you out front and
Yeah.
we can ask those questions for sure, because we'd like to get to that.
So you've already applauding. So I would like to thank Nicole Silverman, Christina Darte, Mark Evans, Elizabeth Kim, and Carissa Phelps. We thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. This is wonderful. And before you take off, I would just like to let you know that Mark Evans will be presenting from 3:30 to 5 p.m. at the Roseville Center. So if you have an interest in continuing this conversation, then I welcome you to join in. And Professor Corey Morgan will be leading that discussion, from what I've heard. Corey? Yeah.
316 Vernon Street,
Yeah.
Roseville Center, around 259.
Okay, so 316 Vernon Street. Yeah, Roseville Center. Thank you so much for coming, and I hope we'll see you next year.